Hi everyone, joining me today we have Dr. Richard Lippa. He's a professor of psychology at California State University, and he's also the author of books like Introduction to Social Psychology and Gender, Nature and Nurture. Hi Dr. Lippa, how are you doing?
Okay, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
Okay, so today I guess we're going to talk a little bit about sex differences and how we can study them and what we know about them. Okay, the first question would be, to start off with, what is so controversial about studying differences in terms of behavioral psychological traits between men and women? I'm asking because it seems to me that there's still a lot of people coming from a social constructionist point of view and they don't problematize much the fact that men and women are physically different, at least in terms of some of their more evident sexual traits. But when it comes to psychological traits, then it seems that it's sort of politically incorrect to talk about them. Why do you think that's like that?
Uh, well, I might not use the word politically incorrect. Maybe I would say politically fraught. And I think you touched on the issue. It should not be controversial, I think, to discuss sex differences because I would hope that any topic is open to scientific discussion. Of course, the problem or the drama arises is because there are ideological and political issues that revolve around this. If there are sex differences between men and women, that collides a bit with the issue of what should be and what ought to be and what is our ideal society. So anyhow, I think the reason it becomes controversial is because there are people with different ideological views and different political views, and sometimes the research evidence may be a little bit uncomfortable for certain ideological positions.
Right. In order for us to establish these sex differences as scientific facts, we draw from many sources. So, for example, we have genetic, neurological, hormonal influences, and we can also look for what would better explain our mental apparatus, let's say, as an evolved system to cope with survival, reproduction, sexual selection, and so on. And we can even gather data in terms of what are the human universals when we talk about cultural anthropology and disciplines like that, and even from other species like we do in primatology. So why is it important for us to have such an approach, and when can we say that evidence is strong enough coming from all these sources that we can say that these sex differences are a scientific fact?
You're correct. There's evidence from many different sources. Scientists tend to be cautious people, so we may be reluctant to say the evidence is 100% showing something, but I assume many of the people who might watch this video are not scientific researchers, so I'm going to try to talk in common sense sorts of ways. One example I like to use is physical aggression. If you look out at the world, I think you'll agree that on average, men are more physically aggressive than women. They're more responsible for violent crimes. I think in the United States, the rate of male-conducted homicide or murder compared to female-conducted homicide is something like 9 or 10 to 1. In other words, most murders are committed by men, not by women. So then you were posing the question, when would we conclude that that kind of difference is for real? And of course, you gather lots of different evidence looking at different kinds of aggression. And your related question is, when would we conclude that perhaps there's a biological or an evolutionary contribution. And I'm always going to use terms like that. There's a biological component to a sex difference, or there's a biological contribution. I would never say that it's 100% biology. Clearly, there's a lot of socialization and learning and cultural factors that influence all of these things. But anyhow, to get back to aggression, we could look at the size of the sex difference in aggression. We could look at factors like, well, are biological factors like hormones related to aggression, particularly male hormones such as testosterone. There are correlational studies that suggest that there is some link between testosterone and aggression. We could look at developmental factors. How early does the sex difference in aggression occur? Do you see it in children as well as adults? The answer seems to be yes. We could look at cross-cultural evidence. Does it seem to universally be the case that men and boys are more aggressive than women and girls? And in general, the answer seems to be yes. We could look at behavior genetic studies, things like twin studies. Is there a genetic component to traits like aggression? The answer seems to be yes. Now, that does not prove that the sex difference is due to genetics, but it certainly says that genetics can impact traits like aggression. So that's the kind of evidence I would suggest. It's almost a kind of triangulation where you're looking at all sorts of different evidence and see if it all points in the same direction.
Okay, so I mean there are a lot of people, and I don't know if you also use this terminology or not, that tend to distinguish sex from gender, and they say basically that sex is the totality of the sex characteristics that are physical. Let's say they reduce it to the physical side of things, and then they talk about gender and they say that gender is all that is related to the behavioral / psychological traits from men and women, and these people usually make this differentiation, and then they say that sex is biological and gender is much more of a social construct. And I mean, since psychological traits also have a biological component to them, would you say that we should keep this distinction between sex and gender, as I put it now, or not?
I think it is a useful distinction. In most of my publications, most of my scientific papers, when I'm talking about differences between men and women or between boys and girls, I typically use the term sex differences because, I'm talking about the biologically defined categories, male versus female. Gender is a bit problematic to me because it's multi-layered and it has many different meanings to it. So it is very common in recent research for people to use the term gender differences to mean differences between men and women. But gender also applies to gender roles. How masculine or feminine are you? And some people use the term gender to refer to gender identity. What's your subjective and existential sense of yourself as male or female? So I think sometimes, in my opinion, the term gender is muddied because it has multiple meanings. That's why I talk about sex differences. People with XY chromosomes versus people with XX chromosomes. And I fully acknowledge there is a big social and cultural overlay on that. But still, again, in my research, I prefer the term sex differences.
So when we talk about the set of psychological and behavioral characteristics each sex exhibits, what you're saying is that it is not at all fixed or determined by genetics or biology, but rather it is influenced by it, right?
Well, I mean, I think my statement, and clearly there would be people who might disagree with this, is sex differences are influenced by biological factors, things like XY chromosomes versus XX chromosomes, hormonal factors, and so on. But they're also influenced by many learned cultural factors, socialization, how parents rear their children, and importantly, the interaction between those two. Biological factors interact with social factors. So I think anybody who, honestly and realistically deals with this topic has, well, I shouldn't say that because there will be people who disagree with me, but there are biological factors and components, there's social and cultural factors, and there's the interaction between those two. Perhaps where the fundamental disagreements are is what's the relative contribution of all of those factors? There's a well-known professor at the University of Wisconsin, Janet Shibley-Hyde, who has what she calls the gender similarities hypothesis, that men and women are much more similar than they are different. So I'm sure if you interviewed Dr. Hyde, she would say most differences are trivial and small between men and women. I disagree with that. I think there are some psychological differences that are at least moderately large and sometimes very large. To give one example, I study a lot in my research what I call gender-related interests, things like occupational preferences. There are big differences. Men, on average, are much more interested in what I call thing-oriented occupations, like being an engineer, a physicist, a computer program. On average, women are more interested in what I call people-oriented occupations, being a teacher, a social worker, a psychologist, a novelist, somebody who deals with human feelings, emotions, interactions, psychological issues, and so on. My research consistently shows, and not just my research, many other people's research, that there are large differences, sex differences. There are large differences between men and women, and they seem to be cross-culturally consistent differences and so on. So I think that's where the difference would lie. Someone like Janet Shibley-Hyde probably would essentially say sex differences are small, and to the extent they exist, they're mostly caused by learning and socialization. My answer instead would be some psychological sex differences are moderate, have a significant biological component. Again, is it all biology? No, not by any means, but still, I do believe, again, this is a very sloppy way of stating it, but again, I'm directing this for non-scientists. I would probably have as a default assumption kind of 50-50, 50% biological, 50% cultural, social, and then I would let the evidence take me away from that depending on what the evidence is. Someone like Janet Hyde probably would say, no, biology is close to zero, environment is most of the story, and the differences aren't that very big. So, that's the spectrum of opinion we have here.
Mm-hmm, right. And so for the psychological traits, and now to refer specifically to the personality traits,
yes.
Would you say that there's a bigger difference between the sexes or inside the same sex group? So, for example, are men more different among themselves, or are men more different than women, and vice versa in terms of personality characteristics?
Yes, there are some complicated technical questions, but again, I'll try to speak simply here. Many psychologists today believe that there are 5 big personality traits in human personality. They're called the big 5 traits, appropriately enough. And those traits are extroversion, kind of, are you sociable, outgoing, friendly, assertive? Agreeableness, are you warm, nice, compassionate? Conscientiousness, are you reliable? Can you be counted on to carry out your word? Do you have good impulse control? Neuroticism, which is a bit of a misnomer. It's kind of, are you anxious, nervous? Do you have many negative emotions? And openness to experience. Are you open-minded, liberal? Do you like to experience and sample lots of different things in life? At least two of those traits do seem to show at least moderately large sex differences. And the two traits are agreeableness. Women on average tend to be more agreeable, nice, compassionate, tender-minded, and so on than men. And the other trait is neuroticism. On average, women tend to be more anxious, have more what's sometimes called negative emotionality than men. So if you look on a trait-by-trait basis, there are at least two broad traits that show, moderate, replicable sex differences. Recently, researchers, and probably the big proponent would be Marco Del Guidice at University of New Mexico, says, well, maybe we shouldn't look on a trait-by-trait basis. We should look at all personality traits combined. And when you look at a kind of combination, then the sex differences are much larger. And maybe to give you an intuitive analogy here, are men's and women's faces different? If you looked at any particular trait, like how long is a person's nose, or what's the space between your eyes, probably no specific facial trait shows a big sex difference. But when you look at the total pattern, if you look at the total gestalt, most of us are very good at distinguishing male faces from female faces. So when you look at the total pattern of traits, there can be a big difference between men and women. But when you look at individual little traits, sometimes it's not so big. So anyhow, my answer is there are some personality traits that show at least moderate, consistent sex differences. I listed two for you, agreeableness and neuroticism. And when you look at the whole universe of human personality, probably there are some pretty big sex differences, some big differences between men and women.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the 10 aspects, because the big five can be divided into 10 aspects, right? Each of the psychological traits can be divided into 2 aspects. So I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard from some people that men tend to fall more under one of the aspects and women under the other one. So for example,
You're talking about sort of super factors?
So, for example, just to give an example, I heard from some people that in terms of openness to experience, men tend to fall more under interest in ideas and women more in interest in aesthetics, for example.
Correct. Those are sometimes called facets. In other words, each of the big five traits has little sub-traits underneath it.
Yes.
And yes, so for example, on openness to experience, there's not a big sex difference there, but if you look at some of the facets, as you were saying, sort of openness to ideas and intellectual experiences, men may be a bit higher on that, but if you look at openness to aesthetic, artistic experiences, women, so you're right, the big five do not capture everything. There are smaller traits beneath the level of the big five, and sometimes they can show substantial differences between men and women. Another example of that would be underneath extroversion is assertiveness.
Yes.
And that tends to show a bigger difference with men more assertive than women, and that can be a moderately large difference. So you're right, the big five does not capture everything, but it's in a way, looking at human personality at a very broad level. And you're right, we could look at human personality in more fine-grained ways as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and now to talk about some of the other main differences and the best established ones between men and women. So, I would like to focus in 4 big themes here. You already talked about aggression. So, in what aspects of aggression are men really more aggressive than women?
Clearly, the largest difference is physical aggression. So hitting, punching, murdering, assaulting, things like that. There is another kind of aggression that's sometimes called indirect aggression or verbal aggression, uh, being catty and, to use English slang, being bitchy, sullying another person's reputation. Sometimes women can do a pretty good job at that. And so the biggest difference in the sex difference in aggression is clearly in physical aggression.
So, would you say that men are more physically aggressive and women could perhaps be more aggressive in terms of more socially aggressive, let's say?
Perhaps, but probably the physical aggression difference favoring men is larger than that indirect or verbal aggression difference favoring women sometimes. So there's a good case where you have to define and specify clearly what kind of aggression you're actually talking about.
Exactly. So, and in terms of sexual behavior, there are also big differences there, right? So, for example,
Correct.
in terms of, and this is just an example, please talk about the others, social sexuality, right? So, having sex with no love involved, men tend to be more inclined to have this behavior than women, right?
Correct. And, from an evolutionary perspective, it probably makes sense that some of the largest sex differences, sex meaning male, female, would show up in terms of sexual behavior because, reproduction and sexuality is the engine of Darwinian natural selection and evolution. And indeed, you mentioned sociosexuality, which is sort of uncommitted attitudes towards sex. If you agree with statements like sex without love is okay, and I can have sex with many different people without being in love or psychologically intimate, there's a relatively large difference favoring men. In other words, men on average express more uncommitted sexual attitudes than women do, and that's fairly, I'm actually in the process of publishing a paper right now where we looked at almost 3,000 Americans across the United States, and that sex difference was pretty large. It was almost approaching one standard deviation, and again, I don't want to get into statistics, but that's considered a fairly large difference. Another one in my research that consistently shows quite a large difference is sex drive. How interested are you in sex? How easily sexually aroused are you? And men tend to be considerably higher on that. By the way, that's not to say there are many women, or at least some women, who are high on sociosexuality and high on sex drive. I'm not making the statement about all men or all women, but just as on average men are taller than women, on average men are higher on sociosexuality and sex drive than women are. So that's the kind of on average statement I'm making.
And just for people to understand a bit better, where does this come from? Perhaps the main reason, at least from an evolutionary perspective, for us to have these differences between men and women would be that to be promiscuous would be kind of a reproductive strategy that would be more favorable to men because, for example, in terms of their gametes, men have less metabolically expensive gametes than women, right? For example.
I mean, it's kind of parental investment theory, you might say. Having a baby is a big investment for a woman, for any mammal. You have to carry this little creature inside your body for 9 months. It's like a little parasite sucking away all your resources. And then your work's not done. You have to go through a very painful and difficult childbirth process. Then you have to lactate and feed this infant throughout most of human history. That takes a lot of your bodily resources as well. And then your work is not over then, because now you have to socialize this child and carry this baby around for a long time and teach it how to speak and teach it the rules of culture. That's a very, very, very labor-intensive and body-intensive process. Women give more resources to their offspring. Men, you know, in the least investing case, this is not true of all men, but they can have a fun night and then disappear into the woods. And the woman is left, you know, making a huge investment in the baby. So anyhow, that's a very commonsensical way of expressing the notion that women invest a lot more in infants. So it would make sense over the course of mammalian evolution and human evolution that men might evolve a strategy more of what you might call promiscuous and uncommitted sex. And by the way, some men do commit to their families very strongly, and there can be social and ecological conditions that promote that. But on average, on average, we know, if you look at modern research, that men have a more uncommitted and what you might call promiscuous attitude towards sex than women do. And clearly, there are reasonable evolutionary theories that help explain that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, and now in terms of cognitive abilities, what are the most robust findings in terms of sex differences in cognitive abilities?
Yeah, there's you know, been a lot of research. Probably the general consensus is there's not that much of a difference in general IQ. However, there are some specific cognitive domains that show some sex differences. Probably the strongest has to deal with certain visual spatial abilities. There's a kind of visual spatial test called mental rotation. It's the ability to kind of visualize objects in 3 dimensions. I would imagine architects tend to be very good at this. And then turn the objects around in your head and recognize if an object that is rotated is the same as an unrotated object. There's a fairly substantial difference favoring men. There are some cognitive abilities, on the other hand, that favor women. Verbal fluency. If you ask a person, think of as many words as you can that mean the same thing as hard, the word hard. Women tend to do better at tasks like that. They're more verbally fluent. There's also certain kinds of spatial memory tasks, remembering the location of objects in an array that women. So there are specific cognitive abilities that do show sex differences.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in terms of interest, so men on average are more, let's say, things-oriented, and women more people-oriented. So would you say that the work coming from researchers like Simon Baron-Cohen related to endocrinology would give a good explanation to these differences? So in terms of sex hormones, let's say.
I think that's part of the story. Simon Baron-Cohen, instead of using the terms people-oriented and thing-oriented, he has his own terminology called systematizing. That's what I would call thing-oriented. Are you very abstract? Do you like sort of deterministic systems, mathematical principles? Are you interested in things like physics and engineering and mechanics? Simon Baron-Cohen also observes that autism rates tend to be considerably higher among males than females, and he has tried to explain the higher rate of male autism as a kind of extreme male brain, maybe because of hormonal factors, the effect of androgens. Men are pushed in this more thing-oriented direction. There's also research, and this gets back to what I said earlier, that you would want to triangulate with multiple kinds of research evidence. There is a kind of unusual development called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH for short, and these are genetically female fetuses and girls who have a genetic abnormality in their adrenal glands, which sit on top of their kidneys, produce too much male hormone. And when these girls who are exposed to elevated male hormone levels grow up, good research shows this, they are considerably more thing-oriented in their interests and their occupational preferences. So certainly that's one kind of evidence suggesting that hormonal factors may play a role in people-oriented versus thing-oriented differences. Now, of course, the other side would come back at me saying there's a huge amount of gender socialization that goes on, and indeed, that's true. Of course, getting back to the interaction between the two, if socialization didn't arise in a vacuum, it probably arises over the course of many generations, partly based on boys and girls' innate kinds of interests. So I believe biology and hormonal factors are part of the story. Undoubtedly, gender socialization and cultural factors are also part of the story. I'm not trying to say it's all biology, but I do think that biology plays a role in that difference.
Mm-hmm. Right. And would you say that there are brain areas or brain regions that are clearly sexually dimorphic?
I'm going to touch very lightly on this because I'm a psychologist and I'm not a biologist or a brain scientist. I mean, ultimately, I assume there will be discoveries about brain differences and neurological differences, and already there is some evidence. But, that's a very new area of research. We have, in recent years, we have all these studies on different brain scanning techniques, and certainly there are some that suggest sex differences. I suspect that research is going to take a while before it all settles down and we come to sort of agreed upon knowledge. But sure, ultimately, I think there has to be some neurological and physiological basis for some of these sex differences. By the way, when we talked about sexuality, we didn't talk about one of the major sex differences, and that is men, on average, are much more sexually attracted to women, and women, on average, are much more sexually attracted to men. I don't think anyone would doubt that there has to be a major biological contribution to that kind of sex difference. Now, again, is your attraction to men versus women influenced by cultural factors in learning? Of course. But again, I think most of us would not doubt that there's a biological component to that as well.
Yeah, and that biological component can also be traced in studies done, for example, in developmental psychology. So there are clear sex differences that are expressed in babies' behavior, right?
Correct. And again, this is we mentioned mental rotation. This seems strange, and you might imagine how they do this, but in recent years there have actually been some studies showing that infants as young as, say, 6 months or so are already showing that male advantage in mental rotation ability. It's really hard at that age to explain things in terms of social learning and gender stereotypes, unless you believe that a 6-month-old baby has gender stereotypes. So again, that's where we would want evidence coming from different sides and different trains of evidence suggesting this.
Mm-hmm. And it's also true that, for example, boys tend to look less at other people than little girls, right? And there's also the experiments with toys that have also been done in other primates, right?
Correct. Simon Baron-Cohen and some of his colleagues have done some of this research showing that in infancy, boys show more of a visual preference for mechanical things like mobiles hanging, and girls show more of a preference for social stimuli like human faces. And once again, if you can demonstrate that those sex differences occur quite early in development, certainly it suggests to me that there is a biological component to those differences. And certainly, as we get older, that relates to what I call the people-things difference. Infant girls showing more of a preference for faces is kind of a precursor of being more people-oriented in your interests, and infant boys being more interested in mechanical stimuli is the precursor to what I call having thing-oriented interests as an adult. So, you know, my intuition, and clearly there's lots of research yet to be done, but my intuition is, yes, there is a biological component to this large adult sex difference we see in people orientation versus thing orientation. Here's another kind of evidence. I published a study a few years ago that actually traced U.S. Department of Labor statistics over a 30 or so year period, and from the 1970s to the early 2000s. And probably no surprise to anyone, women increasingly entered high status fields because this is the women's liberation period, a dramatic period of changing in gender roles. So we definitely see a lot more women physicians and pharmacists and attorneys, and women are entering the high status jobs in increasing numbers. But what was fascinating is over that same period, the difference between what I call people-oriented versus thing-oriented fields, you know, being an engineer, a physicist, a mechanic, versus being a social worker, a psychologist, a teacher, that did not show much change. So there's another interesting piece of evidence. As gender roles changed dramatically from the 1970s to the early 2000s, some aspects of women's work choices changed a lot. They entered more and more high status fields, but that difference between going for thing-oriented versus people-oriented professions did not change very much. Again, that suggests to me that you can't explain this totally in terms of gender roles and social roles, and perhaps there is a biological component to some of this.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of academic choices and occupational choices, let's say, isn't it true that in countries where we find societies where there's more gender equality, that the differences in terms of these aspects, academic and occupational choices, are bigger between men and women than in countries where we find less gender equality?
Correct. And, you know, that's a very puzzling finding. If you believe that differences between men and women are due to patriarchy and gender roles and social stereotypes, then you would think in the most gender liberal countries, good examples would be Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and I'll throw the Netherlands in there too. You would think that gender differences, sex differences would be smallest in those countries because they're liberal, they're free, they let people do what they want to do. Paradoxically, many of the sex differences are largest in those liberal countries. And it's not just true of occupations, it's true of things like personality traits and values and even some physical traits that the gender, I did a study showing it's true of mental rotation ability too. Paradoxically, the difference between men and women is largest in the most liberal countries when it comes to gender. And that certainly goes against, on the surface, social role, gender role, sex role, socialization, and patriarchy theories of sex differences. So yes, that's a big paradox that needs explaining, that many sex differences, psychological sex differences, are largest in the most gender liberal countries in the world.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that a possible explanation for those differences would be that in countries where people have more freedom of choice, their natural proclivities tend to manifest more?
Yes, exactly. You know, when you have freedom of choice, you pursue your choices and your interests. If you're a relatively poor person in India, I'm just using that as I always like to use concrete examples. I do that with my students. If you're a poor woman in India, maybe being a computer program offers you the best opportunity to make some good money and get out of poverty. It's not because you love it, it would be your most favorite occupation in the world. So, I think, putting this maybe in a simple way, I think in the past we focused too much on ability. I think many women have wonderful ability to be scientists. Maybe a question we should also ask is that, are they as interested in being scientists? And by the way, there's interesting recent research suggesting that women are more likely, particularly very intelligent women, they have high verbal ability and high scientific and sometimes mathematical ability. But sometimes their verbal ability is higher. And it makes sense. You'll pursue that career or occupational choice that favors your particular profile of ability. On the other hand, you have more men where their verbal abilities are considerably lower than their mechanical, mathematical abilities. And of course, it would make sense for a person like that to pursue STEM fields, meaning science, technology, engineering, and math type fields. And again, maybe it's not so much prejudice as people pursuing their interests, particularly in liberal and free countries, and pursuing their individual profiles of abilities and aptitudes and so on.
Mm-hmm. And another very interesting type of research that I think also allows us to understand better the sex differences is the research that is done in trying to understand the psychological traits of homosexual men. So, in what ways does this type of research allows us to better understand the sex differences?
Okay. Well, for the sake of full disclosure, I should state that I do a lot of this research. And indeed, now here again, we get to some very politically and ideologically fraught topics because are the stereotypes true? Are gay men, in fact, more feminine than heterosexual men in certain ways? Are lesbian women more masculine, whatever that means, in certain ways compared to heterosexual women? And my research suggests yes. And again, turning back to that central topic of my research, people versus thing-oriented interests, much of my research does show that gay men are more people-oriented in their occupational preferences and their interests compared to heterosexual men. And just to make that absolutely clear to you, in other words, what I'm saying is gay men seem, in a way, shifted in the female direction. Gay men are more feminine or female typical. They may not be as extreme as heterosexual women, but they're shifted in that direction. And similarly, lesbians are more thing-oriented. In other words, they are more masculine or male typical in their interests. Why is that interesting? Well, gay men were socialized as men. They were, or as boys. They were born boys and they were socialized. And similarly, lesbians were born girls and socialized as girls. And the conclusion I come to is there is some innate, that's an offensive word, I know, to some people, but there is some biologically predisposed disposition in pre-gay boys and pre-lesbian girls, which is similar to some of the dispositions we see in girls in general and boys in general. And despite all the pressures of gender socialization, they are who they are and they show their interests as they grow older. Certainly there are some theories of sexual orientation that have focused on prenatal effects of sex hormones. So clearly the logical connection there between sex differences and sexual orientation differences, stating it bluntly, if there are prenatal hormonal effects that can push boys and girls in certain directions, maybe similarly there are certain prenatal hormonal effects that push pre-gay boys and pre-heterosexual boys and pre-lesbian girls and pre-heterosexual girls in similar sorts of directions. So it sort of ties together some of the research on sex differences and sexual orientation difference. One final fact I'll add, we know based on much convincing research that as children, gay boys are already more feminine in certain ways. They experience what's called gender non-conforming behaviors. In other words, as children, boys who are destined to grow up to be gay men are already more feminine in certain ways. They are less interested in rough and tumble play. They're less interested in contact sports that many boys find interesting. They like to play with girls more than the average typical boy does. They sometimes are interested in dressing up and cosmetics. And so these are differences that appear quite early in life. So I think you could acknowledge there does seem to be something corresponding between these gay-straight differences and male-female differences, some of which appear early in development and then express themselves later on in adulthood as well. So yes, I clearly think there are links between this research on heterosexual, homosexual differences and male versus female differences.
Mm-hmm. And because we've been talking a lot about endocrinology here, I think just for people to understand it a bit better, testosterone is linked to aggression, but the role testosterone plays also has a lot to do with context. So, for example, testosterone can have a prosocial role as well, right?
Well, testosterone can have multiple effects, can be related to aggression, can be related to dominance. It can also be, we tend to pathologize testosterone in a certain way, but it can be related to competitiveness and striving for success and achievement. So it has clearly multiple effects. And I don't wish to make the study of testosterone or sex hormones easy or a very direct enterprise. Some people study the level of sex hormones in adults, for example, by taking saliva samples, or you can also do it by blood samples, which of course is more difficult and intrusive. However, testosterone in any person, any man, is fluctuating throughout the day. There are daily cycles. If you're in a competition, your testosterone levels can vary. So once again, we need to gather evidence from multiple sources in multiple directions. And by the way, while the overwhelming focus probably has tended to be on hormonal effects, there are other biological effects that influence sexual orientation and probably sex differences as well. You're probably familiar with something called the older brothers effect or the fraternal birth order effect. For men at least, the more older brothers, the more biological older brothers you have, the more likely you are to be gay. There are theories that partly explain that as an immunological effect. With each additional male fetus a mother carries, there's certain immunological reactions she can have against male factors in the fetus. So I mention that simply to say hormones, I'm sure, are part of the story, but they're not necessarily 100% of the story. We shouldn't forget that there are biological factors in addition to hormones. Hormones are just part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and just before we end, about the social or the socialized component of gender differences. So, are there any gender differences that are completely explained by the social context? That would be the first question. And then the follow-up would be, what are the most scientifically sound theories of gender socialization?
Boy, you're putting me on the spot with that one. I probably start from the default assumption that biology and socialization play a role in most sex differences. I mean, what first came to my mind when you said, is anything totally socialization? maybe certain aspects of dress and grooming, but even there, I'm not sure about that. You would think that, and clearly there's been research on this, you would think the nonverbal aspects of being male or female, just to give an example, men tend to maintain more personal space around their body. They hold their arms and their legs out at bigger angles. Women engage in more direct eye contact during social interaction. We tend to move, there's the stereotype of the swishy wrist as being a kind of feminine gesture. I would think a lot of those nonverbal behaviors have learned aspects to them, but even there, they probably occur or appear quite early in life. Once again, there are significant gay straight differences on those things that probably again appear. So, is there anything that's totally socialized? I'm not sure about that. If you have any suggestions, let me know for what you think might be a total socialization effect.
Well, some time ago I had a discussion with some people because they were saying that perhaps using high heels would be completely socialized, because they talked about how men in the 18th century, for example, there was a trend back then when men tended to use high heels, not exactly as the ones women use nowadays. But and please tell me if I'm correct about this or not, but when I was talking about that, I told people that the effects high heels would have on women would be to exaggerate certain physical traits that men like about them. And in terms of the men using those high heels that even so are different from the ones women use nowadays, that would be related to their height, for them to look taller.
Correct. So you're suggesting there's a different reason for the high heels. It reminds me of the American politician Marco Rubio, who's short. Donald Trump actually ridiculed him for being short. I think he tended to wear elevated heels to give him a little boost. Now, you're wearing the heels in that case for a status and dominance boost in life. I think you're right. Women are wearing them for different reasons. Just to give you a personal anecdote, I remember once when I was teaching an intro psych class, I was jokingly saying to the women in the class, by the way, I'll add to this, at my university, we have parking lots that are far away from the buildings, so students often have to walk large distances. And I kind of said how ridiculous it was for the women to wear these high heel shoes. They're kind of wobbling and walking a mile to get to a class. And some of them were very angry at me, and they said, "We do it because the men like it." So she was honestly stating what you stated before, that they viewed that as being sexually attractive. Somehow it changes your posture and the way you hold your hips and maybe the way your breasts just jut out. So this woman in my class was explicitly stating, look, we're not doing this to be comfortable. We're doing this because men like it and it appeals to men. So you could be very right that there are different calculations to why men versus women would wear high-heeled shoes. Furthermore, unless you're a drag queen, as a man, you're not going to wear a stiletto spike heel. Most of us would have to agree that's a very impractical kind of shoe to wear. But again, apparently women believe it adds to their attractiveness and their sex appeal and so on.
Yes, and if it has to do with these things that I said, then it would have an innate component as well, right?
Correct, it could. And again, that gets back to the question of how culture and biological predispositions interact. So I would assume there's both a cultural component to that, and there can also be some biological components as well. So, I have to think about this for a while, but I mean,
Well,
maybe
perhaps in a
another
few
obvious
months.
one might be hair length, but even there, among young people, you know, certainly when I grew up, it just seemed obvious women have long hair, boys and men have short hair, but that certainly changed a lot over the years. Now, even biology contributes to that because I know this as an older man. It's harder to have long hair the older you get. So there's an interesting developmental change too. We didn't even mention earlier the issue that, you know, hormones kick in a big way at puberty, for example. So it might make sense that certain sex differences that were not apparent when you were 4 years old might kick in a stronger way at puberty when circulating hormones are undergoing dramatic changes in flux. So there's that, you know, if something changes over the lifespan, there's a temptation to say, oh, that's due to socialization and learning. But remember, biology and biological factors can change dramatically over the lifespan as well. Again, deep down, I tend to be an interactionist, thinking there are important biological components. Of course, there are very, very important socialization, learning, and cultural components. And then there's the ever ongoing interaction between those two. So I would never, ever say it's all biology, but on the flip side, I definitely think biology plays an important role in some of these sex differences.
And then again, biology and our psychological proclivities, our natural proclivities also play a role in the development of human culture. So you could have a chicken and egg problem about, are people doing this? Or did they decide to do this, to have this behavior because they were naturally inclined to do this thing, or because someone came up with the idea, right?
Correct. Of course, then partly the debate becomes, and perhaps the strongest proponent of what's called social role theory is Alice Egley at Northwestern University. She would say, of course, biological factors play a role, but they're physical factors. For example, men are physically larger and stronger than women. Women do gestate, carry babies, and lactate, and those physical differences trigger. She's much less willing to acknowledge that there are psychological sex differences that contribute to these things as well. In other words, if you carry the baby and you lactate and you're physically smaller and weaker, well, of course, that's going to put you in the role of mother and home carer and so on. And so some people would say, yes, there are evolved differences between men and women, but they're physical differences. They're not psychological differences. Of course, I might reply to that, well, why are men physically larger than women? There's a whole history of sexual selection that goes on beyond that. Probably there's intra-sex or intramale competition for mates, and that physical difference in body size and muscularity goes along with co-evolved psychological traits like greater physical aggressiveness and dominance driving in men. So again, that's the never-ending debate. Are there actually innate psychological differences, or are there only innate physical differences between the sexes? Again, I do believe that there are some biological components to psychology as well as to physical bodily differences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So just before we wrap this up, Dr. Lippa, would you like to tell people perhaps about some interesting work you're doing at the moment and where they can follow your work? And I don't know if you're active or not on social media. So.
I probably don't tend to do a lot of social media. I think I mentioned before I'm in the process of publishing a large study that looked at some 3,000 Americans from all over the United States. Often we psychologists are guilty of just looking at college students, so this is a more general sample. And I am looking, not surprisingly, at some of the things I talked about earlier. Sex drive, self-reported sex drive, sociosexuality, people versus thing-oriented interests. And so this is a study that focuses both on sex differences, differences between men and women, and also we're looking at that, what I consider an interesting issue of sexual orientation differences. How do gay men, straight men, and we're throwing bisexual men and women into the picture here as well. Bisexual people seem to have some unique differences as well. So anyhow, I continue on some of that research. Hopefully this study will be published in the next year or so. Probably the easiest way to get at this, I sometimes joke with students that if they suffer from insomnia, if they have trouble going to sleep, they should get some of my research papers. Because you just read 1 or 2 pages and then you conk out immediately and you go to sleep. But if you're interested in this kind of research, certainly you can Google my name, Richard Lippa, and you'll probably come up with some of these studies.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Lippa, I would really like to thank you for sparing a bit of your time to being here with us today. I will let you know when the interview is out, because I've been having quite a lot of interviews recently and I'm only putting 2 out per week, so I will let you know, and I guess it's still earlier there than it is here, so I wish you a nice day.
Okay, thank you. I wish you a good night's sleep.
Thank you.
Okay.
If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/thedissenter. Thank you.